I'm 75 now. I was about 14 or 15 at the time. The Walnut Ranch where this occurred is in Lake County in Northern California. It's about 120 miles north of San Francisco, about 130 miles west of Sacramento. And it's up in a mountainous area, lots of brush land, a lot of forest, pine forest. And so this walnut orchard project that my dad was a general manager of was created out of all this very high, thick brushland. And the area is very volcanic, volcanic soil, volcanic rocks, that kind of thing. It's very so they carved this orchard out of a pretty rough area. But the ranch is surrounded on all sides by, some very, very dense brush that I don't know what lives out there. Deer. We had a lot of deer and stuff like that. But anyway, I grew up on this ranch, and I lived there from the time I was 4.5 years old until I went off to college at age 18. And my dad engineered this whole ranch, and the irrigation system was really a difficult thing for him to put together. And so he had this plan eventually that he was going to irrigate the orchard 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, starting in May, and shutting off the irrigation system in September. So he started hiring people from the local town of Kelseyville and Lower Lake and places like that. And these people didn't work out very well. They were not very reliable. They were out there, and they didn't do a very good job. They were drinking on the job. They never showed up for work. And so my dad had a lot of problems with these guys. So he fired them all and really thought he probably was going to give up on his 24-hour irrigation project, when my brother and I thought that, every summer we worked on the ranch, and we thought if we could talk him into letting us just manage the irrigation system, and he just would not have anything to worry about, he just let us do it, then we'd make more money, and we could set our own schedule and do whatever we wanted to do in our off time. And so we approached him, and eventually, after about a day or so, he said, yeah, you guys can go try it, see how it worked out. He saw that we could do it. So we're out there in the middle of the night, 2-3 o'clock in the morning. Sometimes we get up, we go out, and we just move this irrigation pipe all through the orchard. And so on this particular evening, it was probably around 7:30 in the evening, and the sun had just kind of gone down or behind the hills, and we were all done moving the irrigation pipe. And what we were doing, and we had a friend with us that also worked with us, a guy by the name of Jack. He was about our age. And so we were in this old Chevy pickup, old 41 Chevy pickup that my dad had. And we were just driving around the ranch, and we were just looking at the irrigation system to make sure the sprinklers were not plugged up, that the lines were not blowing apart and all that kind of stuff. And I came down to this one corner. It was kind of an intersection. Our orchard was laid out, the 500 acres was laid out in 40 and 55 acre kind of plots. And so each 40 acre parcel of walnut orchard was a quarter of a mile square, 320 feet on all four sides. And if you went diagonally across the 40-acre field, is about 1,870 feet. And this part of the orchard was pretty flat at the bottom where we spotted this creature, but at the top where it eventually went, it got very steep. It got up to like 15% grade, and it was very steep. And because there was a lot of irrigation going on in there, it was muddy in there too. But anyway, to just back up a little bit, we were coming down this road. We made a right turn at this intersection. There was not supposed to be anybody in the orchard. There's not going to be anybody on the ranch. All the hired hands, there are about 5 of them, they went home at 5 o'clock. Mom and Dad are home in the ranch house. And we came around this intersection, and we see something on 2 legs, a bipedal creature of some kind. Didn't know what it was, didn't know what it was walking through the orchard. It was about maybe 75 feet, maybe 100 feet back in the orchard. So we couldn't see anything but just about the knees down or thereabouts. So I kind of pulled the truck around to try to get a better look at what was walking out there. And before we could identify this thing or even get a full look at it, it took off running. So I could see that the animal or the creature or whatever we thought it was at the time was taking off at a diagonal across this particular 40-acre field. And so I accelerated this old Chevy truck, and I couldn't drive through the orchard because it's wet and plowed field and it just gets stuck. So I had to use the farm roads. So I went all the way down, had to drive a quarter of a mile down to where our barns are, turn right, and go up this very steep hill to try to see if I could intercept, this thing that we saw running through the orchard. And so the whole time I was driving and trying to get to a place where we could get a better look at what this thing might be, my brother and this kid Jack, were kind of keeping me informed about the location and the progress of this thing as it came across the orchard. So we got about halfway or maybe 2/3 of the way up the hill, and at the top of the hill was another intersection where more 40-acre parcels came together, and we just stopped the truck and we got out, and between us and the orchard was a really wide drainage ditch that was probably 10 or 12 feet wide and maybe 15, 20 feet wide at that point, probably. And this thing came running up the hill, and we stood there. What we thought was coming through the orchard was a man. And the reason we thought that in the beginning is because about 1.5 miles or 1.75 miles or so to the kind of the east of us was a forestry fire camp. And this fire camp was made up of inmates, convicts from San Quentin prison in the San Francisco Bay Area. They were nonviolent offenders, and they used them. They were kind of like trustees, and they used them to fight fire. And they were pretty successful at doing that. They actually probably outworked the employees in the fire camp. But that's who we thought it was, because we had a history of these guys running off from the fire camp, and they would run across our property, and they would try to get to the nearest town of Kelseyville, Lower Lake, or whatever, and somehow, hide in somebody's trunk. Now, we're talking about the 50s now, where, we had a lot of old cars where you just turned a handle and you lifted the trunk lid and you just climb in. And there were a couple of cases of adjacent ranches where when the women went to town, they unknowingly transported a convict in the trunk of their car. Got to town, they jumped out and run around with their orange suit on, I guess. So that's kind of what we thought was going to be coming up the hill. But when we saw this thing, and it was about 7 or 8 feet tall, it looked to me like it had facial features like an Indian, not the Indians of California in my area, but the Indians of the middle part of the United States. And so this thing, we could hear this thing coming because he was huffing and puffing, because it's really a steep hill. And this creature, 7, 8 feet tall, completely covered with hair, could see no ears. It looked like the shoulders just went up and met the top side of the head. But it had a kind of a rounded head. It had a kind of a broad but long nose. It was kind of hooded like a human, and it had thinner lips than other photographs that I've seen of these things, and it did not have this big barrel chest that so many of the witnesses on your show, Wes, report. This thing was more lean. It probably weighed about 500 or maybe more pounds, but it didn't have this great big. I mean, it was bigger than Hulk Hogan and guys like that. Don't get me wrong. This thing was huge, but it just didn't have this massive chest. And some people have reported that, it had like 5 foot wide shoulders, and this creature was not quite that wide. I would say maybe 4 feet at the most. Arms hung down to below the knees, and this thing's, as it was running, its arms were really swinging in a like 180-degree arc, and it as it came up the hill and it got into the top part of the orchard where the trees were a little smaller because the soil isn't quite as good as down at the bottom of the hill. Why, we could see it a lot better because it was running through smaller trees, and it looked directly at us. And when it did that, my brother and Jack, they wanted to get the heck out of there. Get in the truck. Let's get the heck out of there. I wanted to see where this thing was going, because it looked to me like it was on a mission to go from point A to point B without any interruption and without any real interaction with anybody else. And so when it was coming up the hill and we looked at this thing, it never showed its teeth. It never made any noise other than just heavy breathing and just a little bit of the sound of its footfalls. But not much there, because the orchard was cultivated, and so it's not running on firm soil, on firm ground. It's running in plowed ground that's probably 8 to 10 inches deep, plowed. So not easy going for anybody, including this creature. When we looked at this thing, we had no idea what we were looking at. We had no frame of reference of that. I never heard of a Sasquatch. I never heard of a Bigfoot. I never heard of anything that even closely resembled this thing. There was nothing ever mentioned in school. None of my friends, no adult that I'd ever listened to ever mentioned anything about a creature like what we saw that evening. And it turned and looked at us, and the impression that I got is it kind of grinned at us, but it showed no teeth. And that's when everybody wanted to jump in the truck and just, skedaddle out of there. So when it went by, we jumped back in the truck and we took up. Keep in mind, we got this old 41 Chevy with a 60 horsepower 6-cylinder engine. We're not talking about a muscle car here. And so we took off, and I tried to catch up to it, get a better look. Everybody, my brother and Jack were telling, they don't want to get too close to this thing because they were afraid. And frankly, I didn't feel that way. It was creepy to see this thing. It was creepy when it kind of grinned or whatever it did. That kind of creeped us out. But I didn't feel like I was threatened. It didn't make any gesture. It didn't make any movement, any furtive movement of any kind that really would indicate, hey, I'm going to come over and just rip you to pieces. Never had that feeling ever during this encounter. So we took off up the hill in the old Chevy, grinding up this steep hill, and we closed on this thing to about, I want to say 100 to 150 feet, when it finally came out of the field and crossed a pretty large intersection where all these fields and ranch roads come together. And when it came across that road and that intersection, it turned and looked back at us. And when it did, it just had to kind of torque its whole body around so that it could. I mean, when I wrote to you, Wes, I think I said, it kind of looked over its left shoulder, sorta, and but that wasn't. I mean, it couldn't turn its head. I don't know why these things are built the way they are. I don't know what that design is made for. I really don't know, but it had to turn its entire body to look around, and so its left shoulder and everything all turned and just twisted around. And when it did that, it slowed down, and so we got a little bit closer, and so we were just looking at this thing, and it took off into another 40-acre parcel on our ranch, and so plowed ground. I can't drive out there with this little 2-wheel drive pickup. It gets stuck. So I have to, I want to try, I'm looking at this thing. It appears that it's going to run across this thing on a diagonal again for some reason. So I go down these ranch roads. I go all the way around, got to go a quarter mile this way, quarter mile that way to get around so I can see this thing. And finally, when it came out of the orchard and crossed the farm road that we were on, we got another pretty good look at it and how it ran. And I wouldn't say, I don't remember that it looked like it was gliding, because some people talk about how these things look like they're gliding. It wasn't really like that, although it did not bend its knees. It's like Patty. When she ran, the knees were bent. They're not straight like a human. And so it ran across the road in front of us. And at that point, we were right at the base of a hill, and it ran across the road, and it ran into a property owned by the Wiper family. And not anymore. It's all grapes by some other vintner that bought up all the land up there. But at that point, it was owned by a private a family, and it ran through the area in front of their barns and their shop. And of course, there was nobody there. And it ran through between the barns and the shop, and through about another couple of 100 feet of their orchard, which was walnuts also. And then it just ran into the brushland, into this brush that's 10, 15, 20 feet high, and very difficult for a man to even walk through it. And this thing just plowed through it like nothing could stop it. So when we lost sight of it, we went back to where we originally saw this thing, and that part of the orchard right there where we saw it had just been irrigated within the last day or two, and so it was still pretty wet. And all this ground is volcanic, and it just gets real muddy when and just soggy, and it's almost like clay, almost pulls your boots off, when you walk through it. This thing ran through there, and so we're just kids, we're not thinking about trying to get a cast of some foot or try to figure out what kind of footprint this thing is leaving. We just never thought about that. It's not even in our minds. But we did look and see how wide the stride was, and the stride at the bottom of the hill, and it may have shortened a little bit at the top, was about 25 feet. Each step was about 25 feet. So that meant the orchard was laid out in a way that the rows of trees were 50 feet apart. And so it cleared an entire row between two rows of walnut trees in about 2 steps. And it continued that pace all the way up the hill. And I'm pretty sure that it wasn't taking a 25-foot stride maybe at the top of the hill, but pretty close to it. So a few weeks ago, I calculated that at 25 foot at a stride of 25 foot, that creature would have been able to navigate that 40-acre field in a diagonal direction, 1,870 feet, in about 60 or 70, maybe 80 steps. That's all. And it did that in probably 70 seconds. That's about the time it took for that thing to cross 1,870 feet of diagonal orchard. And that works out to 31 feet a second, or about an average speed of about 21 miles an hour. But when it got to the top of the hill, then the orchard flattened out a little bit for probably a couple of 100 yards. And then it dropped off into about a 12 to 15 degree downhill grade. And the creature was actually, the speed of the creature actually increased a little bit as it went down this hill. It looked like it was on a mission. It looked like it knew where it was going. I have no idea where it was going. All there was in the direction that it was running was the fire camp and a small cattle ranch that was about another 1.5 miles away. And then beyond that, it was just a pine forest and just brushland that hadn't burned in probably 100 years. And some of that brushland, some of the brush was some of those areas was like 30, 40 feet high. So it just plowed through that stuff. It was amazing. So we had a little powwow, my brother and Jack and I, and we were going to go tell my dad what we saw, because we were pretty upset and pretty confused about what we saw, because we just couldn't put it in a category, because it just didn't fit anything. And then we continued to kind of ride around the ranch, check more of the sprinkler system. We're talking about it. We decided, no, we're not going to tell my dad. And the reason we decided to do that is because my dad paid us pretty well to do this job of moving irrigation pipe 24 hours a day, all summer long, 7 days a week. And we didn't want to lose that job. And we're just young teenagers. And if we thought that if he felt that it was too dangerous for us to be out there 2-3 o'clock in the morning with a headlamp on our head like a miner moving irrigation pipe around through the orchard, we thought we were going to lose our job. So we never told anybody ever. And my brother died in 1978, and I have no idea where Jack is. But my brother was an engineer for Halliburton, was killed in a gas well explosion. So to my knowledge, he never told the story to anybody. We just kept it to ourselves. About a year later, we kind of forgot about this. We kind of put it in the back of our mind. But I'll tell you this, every time for quite a long while, every time we went out in the middle of the night to try to move irrigation pipe, I always had this feeling. I think I might have been imagining it because overactive imagination, but I always felt that I wasn't alone, and so I was always flashing my headlight around to see what was around me, to make sure there was nothing sneaking up behind me, and there never was. And so after we had that job in the summer for years and years until we went off to college, we never had another encounter like that, never saw anything again like that, and didn't want to see really anything like that. About a year and a half after this encounter, my dad, who subscribed to True Magazine, read an article about Jerry Crew and his infamous encounters up in the Three Rivers National Forest, up in the Trinity Alps, up there, over there by Wairika and Eureka and over that way. And True Magazine wrote an article about his encounters, and my dad read that and kind of was talking about it, I guess. And so, when he put the magazine down, I'm a year older. I picked it up and I start reading about this thing. And then later I see pictures that had been published in newspapers in the local area around Willow Creek and places like that. And when I saw some of this stuff and I read this article about Jerry Crew's encounters, then I knew what I saw. I knew that I'd seen a Bigfoot, and I knew exactly what it was that I saw that night.